The wind in the Montana high country doesn't just blow, it carves. It searches for the gaps in your cabin logs, the fraying edges of your coat, and the hollow places in your soul that you thought you buried years ago. Silas Vance was a man who knew a lot about hollow places. Silas was built like an old cedar, gnarled, weather-beaten, and stubborn enough to stay standing when everything else had been leveled. He lived 4 miles from a nearest neighbor and 40 miles from a town that cared if he was breathing. He liked it that way. He had his horses, a wood stove that ate timber like a hungry beast, and a past that stayed quiet as long as he kept his hands moving. But the winter of '88 wasn't interested in staying quiet. It was a whiteout, a starvation winter, they'd call it later. Silas was out checking perimeter of his south pasture, the snow already waist-deep in the drifts, when he saw the splash of color. In a world of white and gray, red is a sin. It was a dark, jagged smear across a snowbank near the creek. At first, he thought it was a deer taken by wolves. Then he saw the hand, small, pale, fingers curled like frozen flower petals reaching out of the drift. He didn't think so. Men like Silas don't have the luxury of thinking when the mercury drops that low. He dismounted, his joints popping like pistol shots in the cold. He dug. He found her under a ledge of ice. She was barely 20, dressed in nothing but a thin cotton dress that was more rags than cloth. She was soaked through, her skin the color of wood ash, but it was a red that stopped his heart. Her dress was saturated with it, dark, heavy, and steaming slightly against the killing frost. As he lifted, "Let's continue." "It's cold," she whispered. A sound so thin it nearly broke in the wind. "Please, make it stop." Silas didn't answer. He couldn't. He wrapped his wool duster around her, tucked her against his chest, and rolled for the cabin like the devil was holding the reins. The cabin was warm, smelling of pine smoke and dried coffee grounds. Silas laid her down on the rug before the hearth. He moved with a focused, desperate grace. He built up the fire until the iron stove glowed cherry red. He was looking for the wound. With that much blood, there should have been a hole, a jagged tear from a knife or the neat, devastating puncture of a Winchester round. He looked at her shoulders. Pale, shivering, but whole. He looked at her side. No blood was seeping from her skin. He checked her legs, her back, her arms. Nothing. Not a scratch. He looked down at his own hands, now stained a deep rust-colored crimson. He looked back at the girl. She was unconscious now, her breathing ragged. But as the heat of the fire hit her, her color began to return. The blood wasn't hers. Silas sat back on his heels, the shadows of the fire dancing across his hard-lined face. To have that much blood on you, and not be leaking a drop of your own, that meant something terrible had happened in the whiteout. It meant someone else was out there, or someone else wasn't getting up again. He cleaned her as best he could, his movements slow and careful, the way he'd handle a wounded foal. He wrapped her in the blanket, tucking it tight around her chin. "Make it stop," she murmured again in her sleep. But this time, her hand clawed at the air, as if pushing something away. Silas walked to the window. The storm was a wall of white. He picked up his Henry rifle, checked the action, and leaned it against the doorframe. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know whose blood he'd just washed off his hands. All he knew was that in the West, trouble didn't just knock. It bled through your door. 2 days passed. The storm held the cabin in a fist of ice. The girl, whose name he discovered was Cora, drifted in and out of a fever. Silas didn't ask questions. He did what men of the dirt do. He boiled broth. He kept the fire fed. He sat in his rocker, whittling a piece of oak, watching the way her eyes darted behind her lids. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. She woke to the sound of Silas grinding coffee beans. "You're in my home," he said, not turning around. He kept his voice low, worn like an old boot. "You're safe. For now." She sat up, clutching the quilt to her chest. She looked at the blood-stained rags Silas had left by the wash basin. Her face went even paler. "He wouldn't stop," she said. Her voice was steady now, but there was an edge to it, the sound of a blade being sharpened. Silas poured 2 cups of coffee. Black, bitter. I noticed the blood wasn't yours. It belonged to a man named Miller, she said. He worked for the regulator. They think that because they have a badge and a paycheck from the cattle syndicate, they own the breathing rights to every woman in the territory. Silas handed her the cup. He saw her hand shake just a little. Miller's dead. Silas asked. He is, she said. The snow hit his body. But it won't hide me. The regulator. He's a tracker. He'll find the cabin. Silas looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the bruises on her wrists. Fingerprints of a man who thought he could take what wasn't given. He saw the iron in her jaw. She wasn't a victim. She was a survivor who had fought her way out of hell. I've spent 12 years trying to forget the world exists, Silas said, looking into his coffee. I've stayed out of other men's business and kept my gate locked. I like my peace, girl. Cora looked down. I'll leave as soon as the drifts settle. I didn't say I wanted you to leave, Silas grunted. He stood up and walked to the door, pulling on his heavy coat. I said I like my peace. But I've never been much for bullies, either. And I know the regulator. We rode together in the war. Tennessee, he was the kind of man who enjoyed the burning more than the winning. He stepped out onto the porch. Drink your coffee. I've got fences to check. And a rifle to clean. If you're sitting there in the quiet, listening to the wind howl outside your own window, maybe take a second to pour yourself something warm. Real stories. The ones about the hard choices made in the dark. They take time to settle. If Silas's choice means something to you, hit that like button. It helps the others find their way to the cabin. And if you want to know if the regulator finds what he's looking for, make sure you're subscribed. Because out here, the sun is setting and the real fight is just about to begin. The sun was a cold, pale coin dropping behind the peaks when the sound finally came. Not the wind, the rhythmic, heavy thud of hooves on packed snow. Silas was out front, splitting wood. He didn't stop when the 3 riders appeared at the edge of the tree lean. He just kept swinging the axe. Thwack! The pine split clean. Thwack! The men stopped 20 yards out. They were dressed in expensive furs, their horses well fed. In the center was a man with a face like a hatchet, thin, sharp, and cold. This was Elias Thorne, the regulator. Silas Vance, Thorne called out, his breath misting in the air. I haven't seen you since we were burning barns in the valley. You've gotten old. Silas didn't look up. Old is better than dead, Elias. Though I hear you've been busy making people a ladder. Thorne smirked. It wasn't a kind look. A girl, small, green eyes. She killed one of my men. A good man. If he was one of yours, he wasn't good, Silas said, finally leaning the axe against the stump. He wiped his hands on his trousers. And there's no girl here. Just me and the ghosts. Thorne looked at the cabin. He saw the thin curl of smoke from the chimney. He saw the way the snow had been cleared from the porch. You were always a terrible liar, Silas. Step aside. We'll take her, and I might forget I found you out here. Silas reached behind the woodpile. His hand came up with the Henry rifle. He didn't aim it yet, but the barrel was pointed at the dirt between Thorne's horse's ears. This is my land, Silas said. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was the sound of a mountain moving. I bought it with blood, and I've kept it with sweat. You step 1 foot off that horse, and you'll find out how much I remember about the war. The 2 men on Thorne's flanks reached for their holsters. Crack! A shot rang out from the cabin window. It didn't hit anyone. It took the hat right off the head of the man to Thorne's left. Silas didn't blink. He knew that shot. It was a warning. Cora was standing in the shadows of the window, the barrel of Silas's spare Winchester resting on the sill. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. The girl's got spirit, Thorne said, his eyes narrowing. But spirit doesn't stop a lead ball. No, Silas said, finally raising Henry to his shoulder. But I do. And Elias, I'm better than you. I was better in '64, and I'm better today. You've got 2 choices. You ride back to the syndicate and tell them the snow swallowed her, Or you stay here and become part of spring thaw. I don't much care which. The silence stretched. It was a kind of silence that precedes an avalanche. Thorne looked at Silas, a man with nothing left to lose. He looked at the cabin, where a girl was waiting to finish what she started. He spat into the snow. She's a murderer, Silas. You're harboring a criminal. Out here, the law is what we make of it, Silas said. And today, the law says you're trespassing. Thorne jerked his reins. This isn't over. The syndicate has a long memory. I hope so, Silas called out as they turned their horses. Tell him Silas Vance says hello. The riders disappeared into blue twilight. Silas didn't move until the sound of hooves was completely gone. He stayed on the porch, his breath hitching in the cold, watching the tree lean. The door creaked open. Cora stepped out, wrapped in the heavy quilt. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Why? She asked. You don't even know my last name. Silas lowered the rifle. He looked at the axe, the woodpile, and the vast, empty wilderness. Because for 12 years, I let the world be cold, he said softly. I thought if I stayed quiet, the things I did in the war wouldn't count anymore. But they do. Every day you don't stand up, it counts. He walked onto the porch and looked at her. The blood on your dress wasn't yours, Cora. It was the blood of a man who tried to break you. You did what you had to do to stay alive. Now, you got to figure out what to do with the life you kept. She looked out at the mountains. They'll come back. Let 'em, Silas said. He headed inside. But tonight, the fire is hot and the coffee is fresh. That's enough for now. Over the next few weeks, the cabin changed. It wasn't just a place where a man waited to die anymore. It was a place where two people learned how to live. Cora stayed. She didn't ask, and Silas didn't offer. It just happened. She fixed the chair covers. He taught her how to track in the deep powder. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't have to. The scars on their souls were written in the same language. Sometimes, healing isn't about forgetting. It's about finding someone else who remembers how much it hurt and deciding to stand together in the wind. The West is full of stories about the men who drew the fastest and the outlaws who ran the farthest. But the real stories? They're the ones that happen in the quiet, in the cabins tucked away in the draws where the law doesn't reach. Silas Vance thought his story was over. He thought he was just a gnarled, old tree waiting for the final storm. But life has a way of reminding you that as long as there's air in your lungs, you've got a choice to make. You can stay in the dark, or you can open the door. So, let me ask you something. If a stranger showed up at your gate, covered in someone else's trouble, would you look away, or would you pick up the axe? It's easy to be good when the sun is out. It's a lot harder when the mercury is dropping and the wolves are at the fence. If Silas and Cora's story sat with you for a while, let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from? Is it cold where you are, or are you sitting in the sun? Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey into the high country. Out here, the wind never stops blowing, but as long as we keep the fire lit, we'll be just fine. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and your hand on the plow. The trail continues right here